asked if I could take an exam. 4 lawyers met me in an office. They administered a test, and they wrote a letter to the state of Illinois recommending that I could be granted a license. So I became a self-made lawyer. Wasn't long then before I was invited to pack my bag, move over to Springfield, our state capital, moving from New Salem over there to become a junior law partner with a man named John Stewart. The best part of that was I soon met Mr. Stewart's niece. Her name was Mary Todd. Now, Mary Todd, like me, had been born in Kentucky. She had moved up to Springfield, Illinois to live with relatives. So that's how I met Mary Todd. I courted Miss Todd, and we were married November the 4th, 1842, and eventually we had 4 boys, Robert, Tabby, Eddie, Willie. And I know the adults here have likely heard that the Lincoln-Todd marriage left something to be desired. You see, the 2 of us had come from such different backgrounds. Mary Todd came from a wealthy family. Her father, Robert Todd, there in Lexington, Kentucky, where they lived, he was an established attorney. He was president of the Bank of Kentucky. He could afford to send his children to the very best in private schools. They had wanted for little. And I came from just the opposite extreme. Why, my parents were wrapped up in poverty. I reckon those days in the log cabin school back in Indiana that I attended, if you counted the days I had been in that school by the time I was 18 years of age, those days would not have likely accumulated to much more than a total of 1 year. So when this announcement came in the Springfield paper, Lincoln Todd planned marriage, well, a few of my friends came to me. They were scratching their heads in disbelief. They said, Lincoln, you think this over. Here are the Todds. Here are the Lincolns. Why, you've been a log cabin fellow all your life. You've never had to think a thing about manners and grooming. This marriage simply cannot work. Well, I thanked them for their concern, but I said, we're really going to try to make it work. I know that Todd family. They do spell that name, T-O-D-D, and everyone knew that 1 D had been perfectly good enough for God. I just thought the Todds thought well of themselves. But through it all, we were devoted to each other, and we loved those 4 boys. Now, 5 years after the wedding, 1847, the Whigs of Illinois elected me to go where you're going this morning, Washington City, there to serve 1 term in our United States House of Representatives. I don't think many people remember that. They'll say, well, Lincoln was our president, and yes, but 14 years earlier, there I was in the U.S. House of Representatives, and I met some people there that these students all know. Why, there was a senator there from the great state of Texas, Sam Houston. There was a senator there from Mississippi. Why, I served on a committee with him. His name was Jefferson Davis. Right in the very front row of the Congress was a former United States president, John Quincy Adams. When Adams couldn't get a second term as president, he rushed home to Massachusetts. 2 years later, got himself elected, and then re-elected several times to the House of Representatives. Now, I was present at the morning session of the House when he was stricken at his desk. 2 days later, we heard that he had died. He had been removed only for his own comfort as far away as the office of the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he died there. I was on his funeral committee. Now, I was in Congress. It was called the 30th Congress. You'd have to check what the number is now. And I was there from 1847 through 1848 into March of 1849. And while I was there in 1848, out in what they called then California Territory, somebody discovered gold at Mr. Sutter's mill. So as I was getting out of the Congress in 1849 to go back to Illinois and take up my law practice, there were thousands of men back east, all primed and excited about rushing out to California Territory so maybe they could strike it rich on the gold. Well, I joined those 49ers. They knew they were going to Sacramento, and I stopped in Springfield, Illinois, to take up my law practice. Now, I was in that law practice for 5 years. 1849, 1850, California became a state. I was there till 1854. And in 1854, our country was shaken by an earthquake that would start me to the White House. Oh, it wasn't an earthquake from California. This was a social earthquake. This was slavery. You see, slavery, if I just told you slavery was horrible, you'd stop me and say, Lincoln, say it like it is. Slavery was 1,000,000 times horrible. It was dehumanizing, but it was legal in our South. How did it start? Well, in our early history, we were colonies of Great Britain. And in 1619, Great Britain introduced slavery to us in Jamestown, Virginia. In 1776, a revolution started. Instead of going to be 13 colonies, we were going to be 13 states. And within 2 years, 1778, they understood there would have to be some binding together of those states. And they came up with really what I called our first government, kind of weak. It was called the Articles of Confederation. But each state still did whatever they wanted to. There was no real central focus. It was not much more than a handshake, like New York would shake hands with South Carolina, Virginia would shake hands with Massachusetts, and they'd say, if you ever need military help or financial aid, we're going to be there for you. But the words were empty. And each of the 13 states felt they were better than the other 12. So within a few years, it was understood that this government we were experimenting with, you remember I said it here, if you've read my Gettysburg Address, how I ended it with government of the people, by the people, for the people. You can say that in one word, democracy. But nobody else in the world had that. Russia had a czar. France had an emperor. England had a king. Prussia had a dictator. That kind of leader has his boot on the neck of his citizens. Now, we were going to be different. We said our people are going to control the government. And you know this recently. Every 2, 4, 6 years, they're going to have the opportunity, and I think the obligation, to go to the polls and vote for their officials. We will hold elections. That doesn't happen elsewhere. But if we want to make sure that we keep that to the latest generation, and I'm looking at you today, if we want to keep that for you, we're going to have to rely more on a stronger central government. So over in Philadelphia in 1787, a man from Virginia by the name of James Madison and a committee hammered out a constitution so that we could become a union of states. And that constitution was magnificent, but they had to get it ratified. Now, we didn't have Florida. We went down through Georgia. From Maryland on south, just 7 miles south of where you're seated, the Mason-Dixon line separating Maryland from Pennsylvania. From Maryland on south, they said, no, we want no part of it. You see, we've had slaves now for about 150 years. We're not going to give them up. So if you really want us in that union, you're going to have to find a way to protect slavery here. Well, politicians have a word they use quite a bit. It's called compromise. It generally means that if you want something badly enough, you'll give up something to get it. Well, evidently, our founding fathers so badly wanted this union, they gave up on any restrictions against slavery south of the Mason-Dixon line. That same year, they extended slavery legally to the Mississippi River as long as you live south of the Ohio River and you pulled out of Pittsburgh to become your southern border to get to the Mississippi. 1803, I think you were founded then, weren't you? Well, that year, a president by the name of Tom Jefferson doubled the acreage of our country with the Louisiana Purchase. But all the acres he purchased from France were west of the Mississippi. They started to carve territories out of that purchase. And in 1820, a territory called Missouri applied for statehood. But they wanted to come into the Union with slaves. And the Congress said, well, it's going to take a little doing. You see, we've been keeping our Senate in balance. 2 senators from each state. So we've always had the same number of free states and slave states. So I reckon if you're going to come in as a slave state, Missouri, we're going to have to cut away that northeast corner of Massachusetts and give it a name like Maine to keep the free and slave states together. But the Congress still wasn't finished. They said we're going to draw a line from the west bank of the Mississippi out through the territory Jefferson purchased. Today that would be halfway through Colorado. We're going to call that the Missouri Compromise Line, and if you live south of that line, you can own slaves, and if you live north of it, you cannot. Now, to millions of people back here, and when I say millions, our population then was about 23 million. But millions of those who lived in the Northeast, including Ohio, they hated that. But it had become the law. Here came the problem in 1854, and it came from my state of Illinois. We had an ambitious Democratic senator from Illinois. His name was Stephen A. Douglas, and he thought sure he could get to the White House in 1856. But then he had to calculate he couldn't get there without Southern state votes. So in 1854, he put forth legislation you may have studied about. It would do away with the Missouri Compromise Line. It would let Southern planters take their slaves all the way up to Canada in the territories west of Minnesota and Iowa. Those territories were never to have slavery introduced. Stephen Douglas goes all around my state of Illinois, and his state too, saying to people, well, we can't really be so good as to tell those Southern men you can't take your slaves up there. We just need to change that law. Well, when he said that, I came out of my law practice and I made speeches around Illinois, and I told people to wake up. Don't let Senator Douglas get away with this. If we say that we stand against slavery, right now we're limited as to what we can do. Our government tells us slavery is legal south of the Mason-Dixon line, south of that Ohio River, and south of that new Missouri Compromise line. We're intelligent people. We're law-abiding citizens. So we have to say to the government, we're not here to break a law, but we are here to see that you never expand slavery one more mile. We know, we understand, it's legal where it is now. It's our job to restrict it there. And if we can keep it contained, we're always going to have the hope that somewhere in our future, the majority of our citizens will come to their senses and they'll say slavery is built on poor morality, terrible economics, they'll choose to get rid of it. But if we fall asleep right now and let Senator Douglas get slaves into the Northwest Territories, we could wake up in 2 years and read the headlines in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, United States now a slave nation. When I talk like that, I got a following in the northern states, but I got hatred in the South. But here I am talking about a senator by the name of Douglas from my state, and I'll bet all of you know another Douglas, Frederick. And when Frederick was your age, he was a slave right down here in Maryland. But when he was 19, he escaped and made his way up to Rochester, New York. He became the leader of a political group called the Abolitionists. Now, in 1854, when one Douglas was pushing for slavery to advance, Frederick Douglass called a meeting up in Jackson, Michigan, not too far north of Ohio. And he called together my Whigs, his abolitionists, the Free Soilers, the American Party. He said, gentlemen, we have two things in common. We each belong to a very small political group. And each one of our groups has declared it hates slavery. Why don't we bring those four small groups together, and collectively we may have enough voters to go to the polls this fall and simply say no further advance of slavery. Well, the logic of that appealed to them. They said if we do this, we can't keep the four old names, it's going to confuse the voters. Let's cast them aside and choose a new name. They settled on the Republicans. Out in Illinois, I became a leader in that party. Douglas didn't get to the White House in '56. James Buchanan of Pennsylvania did. And so in 1858, Douglas was still in the Senate. He hadn't come up for re-election. Those Illinois Republicans put me up to run against him for that Senate seat, and that's where we held the Lincoln-Douglas debates. There were 7 of them held outdoors. Large cities hosted them. The crowds were huge. They came on stagecoach trains, they rode their buggies, so you would have several thousand of each debate. And the debates were about slavery. Douglas pushed for expansion. I tried to rein it in. It drew national attention. The Cincinnati Gazette, the Toledo Blade, the Philadelphia Eagle, they sent reporters out to Illinois, and they wrote their stories all about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So I felt that at night, people in Cleveland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, they were picking up their newspapers. They were reading what Lincoln thought about slavery and other important issues. So after the debates were over, I felt I was far better known outside my home state of Illinois than I had ever had been before. If you would have been at one of the debates, you'd have probably chuckled a little bit, because to look up at that platform that had been constructed, you see Douglas and myself standing there. We made kind of a Mutton Jeff picture, because he was only about that tall. They called him the Little Giant. Now, to show you how smart he was, in 1858, there was a temperance movement going through the land. Temperance, no sale of alcohol, illegal. And Douglas gets up at the last debate. He says, "Well, Mr. Lincoln told you that he started here in Illinois as a shopkeeper." Well, they all nodded, because I told him that 15 minutes earlier. But he said he forgot to tell you something. In that little store in New Salem, he owned a liquor license. Can you just now hear 3,000 people deeply inhaling at the same time? If I would have had my hat on, I think it would have sucked it right on. Well, I knew I'd have to address that. So when I got up, I said, well, I reckon it was good for Mr. Douglas to review the history of my store there in New Salem, and he's being very truthful with you. I did. I owned a liquor license there. But what he forgot to tell you was that in my store, I was always on the rear side of that counter. He was always out on the front side. Well, he won the election. He went back to Washington, but that following year, 1859, I was invited to speak about slavery. Up in Milwaukee, out in Kansas Territory, some of the New England states. On a September night in 1859, I addressed a statewide political rally over in Columbus, Ohio. The following morning, the Sandusky, Ohio newspaper called the Register headline, "Mansfield Group favors Lincoln as next Republican candidate for president." Well, the next year, 1860, was the election. When the Republicans held their convention in Chicago to nominate a president, everybody thought they would nominate William Seward, the popular senator of New York. But on the third ballot, they nominated me, and people sang a little song about me. Old Abe Lincoln came out of the wilderness down in Illinois. 33 stars on the flag. 10 of them in the South said, "We'll never put his name on the ballot for the fall election. We hate Abraham Lincoln. He's the man who says he won't let me take my slaves into the Northwest Territories. Why would we ever give him a single vote?" Well, if I couldn't get votes in 10 of our 33 states, how could I win? Well, the Democrats divided. Northern Democrats wanted Stephen Douglas. Southern Democrats looked at that and they said, "No, he's not the champion we really thought he was on slavery expansion. We want John Breckinridge of Kentucky." So we had two Democrats running for the same office in 1860. And then an independent came in, John Bell of Tennessee. So we had Lincoln, Douglas, Breckinridge, Bell. When the campaign started, I had no beard. I received a letter from a little girl in Westfield, New York, south of Buffalo. She said her name was Grace Fidel. Said she was 11. Said her daddy had come home from the county fair the night before, and he had a poster with him. As they unrolled the poster, there were the pictures of the four of us men running